Well everyone, the Samsung Galaxy S10 Plus is one of those phones that came out so many years ago, and the thing I would definitely tell you is the Galaxy S10 Plus is such an interesting device. I liked this phone when it first came out, and I still think it's completely worth buying. It was worth buying a couple years ago. I do think there are probably better alternatives to buy more so than this device, but it was always so interesting whenever I went ahead and compared this phone against some other devices, because Samsung just knocked it out of the park this year, and I do think for the most part it is a very interesting device when it comes down to it. So we'll talk about that throughout this entire video. If you want to buy some phones though that I would still recommend buying this year, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the Samsung Galaxy S10 Plus, this particular phone on the front has a massive 6.4-inch dynamic AMOLED display. It's a very big panel, and it's a very good panel at that. I liked this phone a lot when it first came out, and I still think it's a very, very good device. It's a very good panel. You have the curved sides to it, which look really good. They're just curved, which is great. Getting that dual camera setup at the top right as well. And it was a very big difference coming from the Galaxy S9. When Samsung came through and made the S9 and they made this phone, that was a very big difference. I was actually very shocked at the way Samsung approached this particular device, because they really did kill it. They did a tremendous job with this whole entire body, and when they first made it up until this point, they knocked it out of the park, which was something I really did like. Now, the thing that is kind of missing with this phone that most phones kind of have nowadays, there's no 90 or 120 hertz. A majority of phones basically have that nowadays. Unfortunately, this phone doesn't have it, but it's still totally okay. We totally get it. You're still getting a fingerprint sensor in the display too, so still a very good, high quality 1440p display. On the bottom, you are getting that USB Type-C port, which was great, and it did have Samsung DeX as well. So you can go through, connect this thing to some sort of a DAT, a monitor or something like that, and output a desktop experience, which is really cool. It also had a headphone jack, which this was one of the last Samsung S phones to have that headphone jack. Very crazy thing, such a cool thing to have as well. And that was another awesome thing going on here. And we also had a micro SD card slot. This was not the last phone to have a micro SD card slot, but it was still a super cool thing to have. And that right there was another very, very cool thing going on for this particular phone, that it had all three of those things. A majority of phones only have one, which is USB-C. This one had so many different things going for it, which was generally so amazing, and one of my most favorite things going on for this particular phone from that perspective. On the backside, you had this standard glass back on it. So this was something that was very cool as well. So it's just a full-on glass back, and you have a triple camera setup as well. So the thing with this I/O, on the outside and then front side and all that, is that it's just such an amazing phone to have. It's such an amazing experience to have, and that is by far one of my most favorite things going on for this particular phone, was that it holds up so well from that particular perspective. It's insane how good of a job Samsung did with this phone, and when I look at everything on the outside, it is a very good phone from that perspective. Again, it's not perfect or anything, but at that time it was very close to perfect. The only thing that this phone is missing on the outside that most phones have nowadays is frosted glass backs, 120 hertz panels, and maybe that's it. Beyond that, this is an excellent panel that I'm a humongous fan of, without a doubt. So that kind of covers it up there. Now, from the pricing strategy standpoint, this phone is still available all over the place. You can buy it really wherever you can buy phones at. The only thing to keep in mind is that with this particular phone, it is basically it's like a sub $200 phone, probably in a lot of areas. So if you're going through and if you're wanting to go ahead and buy some sort of phone, this thing is around a $200 device that you can buy, but I probably wouldn't recommend buying it. We'll talk about that throughout this video, but for the most part, you can probably buy this phone for around $200, and that's a pretty decent price if you're thinking about it. It's a triple camera setup on the backside. Well, moving on to the camera now. We have a triple camera setup on the backside. So it has a 12 megapixel wide, 12 megapixel telephoto, and then a 16 megapixel ultra-wide camera. You're getting basically a 10 megapixel wide and then an 8 megapixel wide angle lens on the front. So a dual camera front camera, which was a very interesting design choice. The thing with this particular phone is that you are getting 4K at 60 on the back and 4K at 60 on the front, which was very nice to have. This was kind of the first time on a Samsung phone that we actually ended up having that type of capability. So that right there was something that was very cool, because having 4K at 60 on the front and the back was awesome. One of, again, my most favorite things going on for this particular phone, and at that time it was a very big deal. Now, I also love that this phone gave us 3 cameras. All this S10s basically gave it to us except the S10e, but it was still a very cool and nice thing to have on these particular devices, because you can easily just go ahead and just use this camera as you normally would. And again, that was one of my most favorite things going on for this particular phone, was that you could easily just go through and essentially just have a really good camera on this thing. And I was a massive fan of that particular phone from that perspective too. I look at this phone and I still think it's an excellent phone in so many different ways, and I do think it is a very, very good device for the most part from the camera side. So from that area, that kind of covers it up there. But the one area with this phone that kind of hinders me a little bit of recommending it to a vast majority of people would probably end up being the software longevity. This phone, as of right now, isn't really supported with software. Like it kind of is, but not really. It's kind of hindering me from like recommending it to a vast majority of people. And the reason for that is because I don't want to recommend a phone to people to buy if it's already going to be outdated. And that's essentially what's going on with this particular phone. Like this was a really good phone, and in some ways it still is a really good phone. And it compares fairly well against phones like the Galaxy S24 Plus and S23 Plus. Clearly those phones are much better in every single way. But when I compare this thing against those phones, like it still has some qualities to it that are similar to those types of like newer flagships. The problem is that this phone isn't really giving us any more software updates. So that is kind of the problem going on here. Like with this type of device, like if you're going to buy it, I mean, that is going to be one of the problems, right? Because you don't want to go ahead and buy a device and it's already going to have some sort of like issue with it. And I'm not saying this device is going to be giving you issues. The problem is that this device is already kind of outdated with software. So it does have issues. If it does have issues, you can't really fix them if they're software or hardware problems, if they're software issues. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. Again, I don't even think it's the biggest deal in the world, but that was just one minor thing to keep in mind there. So from that perspective, again, it's not the biggest deal in the world, but if I am going to go through and actually use a device, I kind of want it to still have software, support, and this device isn't really going to be giving you that. So kind of keep that in mind there. Not the biggest deal in the world, but just kind of keep that in mind there. In terms of performance, this device is going to be giving you that Snapdragon or the Qualcomm Snapdragon 855 chipset, and they're going to be giving you 8 gigs of RAM on the mid-tier models, or 6 or 12 gigs of RAM for the lower and mid, top tier models. So you have the range from 6, 8, or 12 gigs. And the thing I'll definitely tell you from that particular perspective, from that standpoint, is that you are actually going to be getting, in my opinion, a decent performing device for how old this phone is. Like this thing is still actually like a decent performing device in a lot of different ways, which is genuinely actually very cool. If I'm going to go ahead and buy a device, like I want it to have some sort of capability and quality, and this is actually a fairly good device from that perspective, which is actually very cool. So once again, if I'm going to go through and buy a device, this is actually a pretty decent option. Again, not perfect or anything, but it is a very okay performing device. Again, if I compare it against the S24 Plus and whatnot, it's not going to be that great. But whenever I messed around with this, it was actually pretty good. And that was something I actually did like a lot about these particular devices. So that right there is another thing or minor thing to kind of keep in mind there. The battery life also was actually decent, a 4100 mAh battery at that time. You had wireless charging and reverse wireless charging too, which was actually pretty cool. But again, compared to nowadays, it is kind of an outdated, it's like a smaller size battery than expected, but still perfectly fine for the most part. So in terms of that kind of covers up the entirety of this particular phone. And I will tell you, as you probably would have guessed, I don't really think this phone is worth buying anymore. Like this phone wasn't really worth buying even back then. And I still don't really think it's worth buying. Like this phone was definitely worth buying back then. But I do think like in the last like year or two, it really wasn't worth buying. One, because the newer phones have came out and because the older flagships, even newer than this one, are starting to become cheaper in the used market. But also because of the lack of software updates. I don't want people to buy this phone and already have it outdated like with software. And that is kind of what's going on here. So beyond that though, I love this phone a lot. I love all the S10s, but I don't think this would be the phone I'd recommend people to buy anymore. So that kind of covers it up there. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.